Professor Allott, in our previous interview on Friday last week, talking about the earlier part of your career, we reached your involvement with the ICJ Northern Cameroon's case in 1963, and I wonder if we could complete this section on your time as a civil servant in the Foreign Commonwealth Office. Perhaps before we do that, we might just pause in case there are any memories that you perhaps left out of the previous interview.
Yes, I think there was quite an important one that I should have mentioned, which took place in 1962, which was my first conference at which I actually spoke on behalf of Her Majesty's government. And so that was a sort of heady moment of power. And it was a conference in Meyrin in Switzerland, just near Geneva, near the border with France, at the CERN headquarters, where it was a conference to establish what eventually became the European Space Research Organization, ESRO. And this thing had been the brainchild of a man called Harry Massey, an Australian, an immensely live wire Australian, who actually had been a research student at this college, Trinity College. And he was the great moving spirit, Harry Massey. His research supervisor was Paul Dirac, a very famous theoretical physicist at St. John's. And I can't resist recalling a famous thing said about Dirac, who was an immensely silent man. And it's said that his friends invented a unit of measurement called a Dirac, which was defined as 1 word per hour, which I've known people like that, and I've known academics like that. And I was just thinking that I can't remember who said it about whom. It's completely irrelevant to this interview, but it was said of somebody that he was silent in 5 languages. And I've known academics like that as well. It drives one mad. But anyway, the European Space Research Organization, so we were there creating this thing, which was a sort of convention establishing a body. And so at that conference I actually did speak on behalf of the British government with sort of scientists on the delegation. And then that led to a very strange thing, I think probably the following year, which was the creation of a body called the European Launcher Development Organization, ELDO. And that arose because British engineers had designed a rocket called Blue Streak. I think it was originally military, but the military didn't want it. So they said, why don't we make this the first stage of a space launcher? So we had to sell that to the Europeans, that this Blue Streak would become the first stage of Europe's own space thing. And the Minister of Aviation at the time was Peter Thornycroft, who became a very leading conservative politician, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Secretary of State for Defence and so on. And so and I remember there that it was run in Whitehall by the Ministry of Aviation. He must have been Minister of Aviation. And I remember, I've not forgotten because it's in my favour, that on the Monday of one week, the Minister of Aviation sent me a piece of paper giving the sort of terms and conditions for participating in what they call this club. And by Thursday, I'd produced a complete convention establishing this organization, which slightly amazed them. I'd obviously copied it from other conventions of other organizations, but it was complete, from Article 1, there is hereby established, to this convention shall enter into force. And then we went to Strasbourg, and I remember stayed in a very grand hotel, the Chateau Rouge, with Peter Thornycroft, who was a great bon vivant. He, if I may go anecdotal. He married as his second wife the Countess Roberti, who was the mother of a boy I'd been at school with, Piero Roberti. She was one of the founders of Venice in Peril, Lady Thornycroft. And little Piero Roberti eventually succeeded to the counthood and became Count Roberti and married, would you believe, the daughter of the Graf von Stauffenberg, who was executed following the plot against Hitler in 1944. And I think Piero himself was killed in a ballooning accident. I can't remember the details of it. So there we were in Strasbourg with Peter Thornycroft, who, as I said, we had marvellous meals because he was greatly keen on that sort of thing. And so that was created. And then eventually, ESRO and ELDO were combined to form what is now the European Space Agency. Since about 1975, it's been called the European Space Agency. So that was a very interesting thing. But from last time, we got to the stage where I was just about to go to Berlin in 1965. And I then became legal advisor to British military government, Berlin. Of course, Berlin at that time was divided into the 4 sectors, British, French, American, and Russian. And we were in West Berlin, the 3 western sectors. And in East Berlin, there was supposedly the capital of what the Russians called the German Democratic Republic, which we didn't recognize as a state. We regarded it as the Soviet occupation zone of Germany. We had created the Federal Republic of Germany in our occupation zone. For some reason, we were able to say that that was a state, and the German Democratic Republic wasn't. Eventually, the House of Lords in the Carl Zeiss case held that the British courts could give effect to the legal acts of the GDR, even though the British government didn't recognize it as a state, on the very interesting grounds of the House of Lords that the GDR was the agent of the Soviet Union. So they managed to avoid undermining our non-recognition, but were able to give effect to the fact that the GDR was a vast state producing vast amounts of law. So there we were in West Berlin, and of course this was the height of the Cold War, and people nowadays who didn't live through it can't imagine what the Cold War was like. The whole world was divided in effect into 2 camps run by Washington and Moscow, and there was a so-called Third World, which was more or less non-aligned if it was not in one of those 2 camps. So that meant that international relations for a while were incredibly simplified. Obviously now looking back, it was a state of total lunacy because it was based on the ultimate nuclear deterrent so that neither side could go too far in any direction in taking over other countries. And we in Berlin were sort of an absolute hotspot because Berlin was at the center of the GDR, surrounded by this Soviet zone of occupation. And the Russians obviously had isolated Berlin in 1948, leading to the Berlin airlift. And in 1961, they'd caused the construction of a wall dividing the eastern Soviet sector from the western sectors. And it was always seen as a potential flashpoint. If the Soviets wanted to create trouble, they would simply march into West Berlin because they had 21 divisions stationed in East Germany. And of course they could. We used to have exercises, military exercises in West Berlin with scenarios based on having become a world sort of diplomatic incident place. Completely laughable exercises, obviously, from the British point of view. But we had to sort of draft statements and statements of shock and horror at what the Soviets were doing and all that sort of thing. And that was sort of fun. Our offices, the British government offices, military government offices in Berlin, were in the Olympic Stadium, which had been built for the 1936 Olympics. And our offices were in the building of the Sport Ministry, the Reich Sport Ministry. Sort of great brutalist concrete thing, rather like the stadium itself. I had a very large office, which was full of sort of heavy German furniture, including, I remember, a grandfather clock that didn't work, that had a big swastika on the front of it. It never worked. I, at the time, had the equivalent rank of Lieutenant Colonel, which was a little bit unlikely given that I was only 28 and looked about 17. But we worked very closely with the army, obviously the occupying army, and the head of the whole thing, British thing, was a general, whose name I now forget. And his deputy was the senior Foreign Office person there, Deputy Commandant. And so our offices were just beside the army's offices. And so that's the first time I'd been in close contact with the British Army, which I came to admire, I must say, the way they worked. But there was a comical element in that, I remember, in that they had a string of offices with the general at one end and a sort of a corporal at the other end. And in between there was a brigadier and a colonel and a lieutenant and a sergeant and a corporal. And the way it used to work was that the general would utter something, and that would then be passed down this hierarchy. And there was a marvellous sergeant who actually did all the work. All the others were far too grand to work. But there was this tubby sergeant who actually did everything. So we had to work with them, and we had obviously endless meetings with them. And they had an odd attitude to us. They always, not always, but occasionally started sentences with, "Of course I'm only a soldier, but," because they regarded us as sort of in possession of higher wisdom, and they being nuts and bolts people. It was an act, obviously, because they were extremely skillful in their own profession. But that was extremely interesting, and there were lots, endless, because the army in those days was a very social thing, very sociable. So we had endless parties, I remember. We lived in a block, all the non-army staff, just beside the NAFI, the sort of army supermarket. And there was nothing much else to do except to have parties. We had an officers' club just near us where we played tennis. And we could go into East Berlin. We had Allied rights, as they were called, to go into East Berlin in our cars. We couldn't go into East Germany, beyond East Berlin. And I can't remember what the basis of those rights was. I must have known, since I was supposed to be the legal advisor. So we used to go into East Berlin more or less to prove these rights. And so we would go to the opera, the Staatsoper in the Unter den Linden, or go to the Brecht Theatre or something. And of course East Berlin was infinitely miserable and sad, grey place, and very poverty-stricken. So that was a very peculiar life. One would go from playing tennis and sweating, dash in one's car to East Berlin and go to Wagner at the Staatsoper, which I used to worry dreadfully. Well, I mean, the whole thing was full of terrible anxiety, but I used to worry that somebody, would slash our tires in East Berlin and a great diplomatic incident would occur, or driving from Berlin to Germany, to the British zone in Germany. You used to go down the remains of autobahns, but the East Germans had allowed the one to the west to collapse and to, the surface to collapse. And I used to worry dreadfully that because they used to change the speed limit down to sort of 20 kilometers an hour when there was a bad road. And I was very nervous that one day I would exceed the speed limit and land up in Leipzig or somewhere as a prisoner of the East Germans.
Which could have happened.
Very easily happened. So I did observe those speed limits. And obviously the whole place was shrouded in sort of secret goings-on, because the Cold War had a sort of second hidden war, a war of spying. So there was a great deal of that. I remember meeting a famous East German lawyer called Wolf, who was the great one who organized spy exchanges. I did attend a spy exchange on the Glienicke Bridge, I remember, which was infinitely less glamorous than appears in the films. But that was a sort of, to an anxious person like myself, it was a continuous worry. Now, another thing I remember is that during my time there, there were student riots in Berlin, West Berlin, because it was the beginning of that time of student riots all over Europe. And they were really quite violent in Berlin. And one day I remember going with Christopher Malaby, who eventually became ambassador in Bonn and Paris, to the back room of a cinema in the Kurfürstendamm to talk to one of the leaders of these student riots. We must have got a telegram from the Foreign Office asking us to please establish what their aims and purposes were, these revolting students. And these two ludicrously British people went and talked to these fierce students. I can't remember if we got anything at all out of them, but I'm afraid that's the sort of way we behaved. So that, and of course we read the East German newspapers, Neues Deutschland, and we watched East German television, and we tried to form views about what was going on. And so every Friday, I would be driven to a meeting of the legal committee of the Allied Kommandatur in the American sector, where I would meet the French and American legal advisors. And obviously the Russians didn't any longer come to that. We kept a place for them, but they didn't come. We never had much work to do, but again, it was symbolically important that bodies of the Allied Kommandatur should meet. The Russians only took part in two remaining things, Spandau prison and the air control system in Berlin. And in Spandau prison, for major German war criminals, I and the American and the French, and theoretically a Russian, were the higher executive authority of Spandau prison. We constituted the higher executive authority. And there were three major German war criminals remaining in my time: von Schirach, Speer, and Hess. And we let two of them out in 1966, von Schirach and Speer, and that left Hess as the only remaining person in this vast prison, just one person. And we, the British, thought that this was a bit ridiculous. Either he should be released, or we should put him somewhere smaller. Well, the Russians objected constantly to that. They would never allow him to be released, and of course he eventually died in Spandau prison, Hess. I remember drawing up on a piece of squared paper a little prison building to be put in the courtyard of Spandau, just for one person with the usual facilities. But again, the Russians wouldn't hear anything of that. He must remain in this vast echoing dark prison by himself, and of course he went slightly odd. And below us, as the higher executive authority, there were people called governors. Colonel Banfield was our governor. And the American governor was called Gene Black, I think, and he became famous because he became terribly friendly with Hess and wrote a book about it. And that was severely frowned upon by everybody, above all the American government, obviously. But no doubt it sold extremely well, this book. The oddest feature about all that, I did see Hess in his cell. I didn't speak to him. He was not allowed to speak to us, I don't think. There were warders he spoke to, or the governors he spoke to. But etched on my memory is the sight of him, this gaunt man in his cell. Standing at the far end of the cell, we standing outside, he being spoken to in the distance. But the oddest thing about the whole thing was quite unbelievable, namely, every month we had a lunch in Spandau prison, and to which guests could be invited. And the lunch, each of the four powers was in charge of Spandau month by month. And each of these lunches were catered by one of the four powers who was in charge that month. So we'd have Russian food one month and French food another month. And there was a cocktail party before it, in the prison. Most bizarre. And again, the thought was that anything to get the Russians to come to things. So there were, every 4 months, there was an extremely vodka-filled lunch. And I remember Mrs. Banfield, the wife of the governor, saying, I always stand near a potted plant to get rid of the vodka. She felt that she couldn't simply refuse it. But that was extremely bizarre event. And the main excitement, I remember, was when a Russian fighter, for some peculiar reason, ditched in a lake in the British sector. And of course, we hadn't had our hands on a Russian fighter, to put it politely. So we took a fair amount of time to decide to return it. That was a major excitement. But we never actually had the ultimate diplomatic incident of them moving into West Berlin, the Soviets. So I was there for 3 years until 65, 68.
Professor Allott, 68 was the year of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Yes.
Did you have any...
No, I didn't. It wasn't involved. I would have been if I'd still been advising that department in the Foreign Office, but I wasn't involved with that.
I also wondered whether you experienced in your department much consternation or fallout as a result of the invasion by Russia of Czechoslovakia.
Well, no, the events eventually in 68, because we were very remote, to be quite honest, and for obvious security reasons, telegrams were not copied to us in Berlin unless they were relevant to us. Because I can't emphasize strongly enough that the atmosphere of secrecy was absolutely overwhelming. One assumed that there were microphones everywhere. And there was nothing much you could do about it. And one assumed every detail of one's private life was seen by somebody, somewhere. And one assumed that on our staff there were probably people who were recounting things to the East, because the East German secret police obviously were an extremely efficient lot, to put it very mildly. One other tiny thing I remember is that we all shared a German language teacher, the British lot, called Ingo Weber. And in my novels called Invisible Power, I've made Ingo, the son of the Countess in those novels. I've tried to pop in interesting people's names into the names of characters in those novels, but that's why that character is called Ingo. I'm not sure I learnt very much German. I read it, but I don't speak it very well, and so I think we maybe just talked about things. I had an English secretary and a German secretary and a German legal advisor. And the German secretary, a delightful woman called Frau Olivier from southern Germany. And my English secretary was a daughter of somebody in the army. And the German legal advisor was called Herr Kaufmann, who dealt with sort of legal matters affecting the German system. Oh, one other thing I'll mention is that they had an annual lawyers' sort of bar association dinner in Berlin, to which one went to, and I remember sitting beside an elderly man at one of those bar association dinners who told me that he'd been defense counsel for one of the defendants in the Nuremberg tribunal. And I think he defended Dr. Schacht, who had been head of the Reichsbank and economics minister under Hitler. And I think Schacht was acquitted, one of the few people who was acquitted at Nuremberg. So this chap must have done a good job. He was a very nice, charming chap, this defense counsel, but he obviously must have done a good job. I have to say we also visited the awful prison, which by a Freudian block I've forgotten the name of, where the most terrible executions took place, which I will not describe, under the Third Reich. But thank goodness I've forgotten the name of that. That was infinitely distressing. So that was an odd experience, I have to say, and the net result of it, obviously, was to convince me of A, the ludicrousness of the Cold War, and B, the general horror of European history in the 20th century, that this wonderful, cultured nation, who I, came to admire even more there, could have been involved in this absolutely dreadful thing. Those had huge long-term life effects, and no question about it. And then I may have forgotten something significant, but I'll go on now to the time I came back, shall I?
Was that when you became the advisor to the Arabian department?
Yes, in 1968, I must have been sometime then, I became the advisor to Arabian department. And that was quite an interesting time because the British government, Labour government, announced that we were withdrawing from the Persian Gulf to save the costs of stationing British troops there, which I think was something ludicrous like 300,000 a year or something. We had been, the British, in the Persian Gulf since 1820. We were absolutely deeply involved in their history. We were very fond of them, all these rulers in the Persian Gulf. They were very fond of us, and they asked us not to leave. But we did. But that led to quite complicated problems, because there were all sorts of disputes, territorial disputes in the Persian Gulf, which had been sort of pasted over for years. And also we had to, and the British had enormous investments, oil investments in the Persian Gulf, obviously. Since the beginning of the 20th century, we've been involved there in the oil industry and with the Americans. And to be perfectly simple about it, we sort of did rather control all these little countries, and we used to sort of write the legislation for them applying to these oil companies. And we had glamorous people called political agents who, since the 19th century, were allegedly advising the rulers of these countries. The most marvelous job, really. They were sort of ruling them, to be quite honest, these political agents. And it was the time when the Foreign Office was full of so-called Arabists. They went to a school in the Lebanon to learn to speak Arabic, and probably to learn one or two other things which I won't mention. And they were they knew all there was to be known about the Arab world. And it's, for old-timers, it's a great loss that they've all disappeared, those people. Now, with the fabulous problems of the Middle East, you would have thought they were quite important people. So we had, and then the other thing we had obviously to do was to decide what political organization should succeed us, really, in all these little countries. And we'd been involved even in the bigger picture, sort of creating Saudi Arabia and creating Iraq after the First World War, and deeply involved in the history of Iran, former Persia. So it was a traumatic thing, suddenly disappearing. And so there were all these disputes, particularly territorial disputes, the ownership of islands, and sea boundary disputes. And one of the main disputes was with Iran over some islands called Abu Musa and the Tums, and which were claimed by Iran, but we said belonged to one of the rulers. And there were obviously oil reserves around these islands, so it was quite important who they belonged to. And so that led to one of the greatest excitements, because there were two American oil companies interested, one Butte's Oil and Gas and the other Occidental Petroleum. And I have to be careful what I say, because would you believe there are still ongoing legal proceedings? A former student of mine said, "I've been reading a letter of yours about that dispute. And how could you have written such a letter?" And I was staggered that under the 30-year rule he'd been able to read this, because there's a famous exception to the rule under which government documents are available to the public after 30 years. The exception is except in relation to ongoing disputes with other countries. So I was staggered that he'd read this, and so I refused to comment to him in any way, he being involved in the current legal proceedings. So Occidental Petroleum was run by an extraordinary man called Armand Hammer. Butte's Gas and Oil was run by some man whose name I forget now, I think called Ely. And so we had to decide which of these two companies to prefer. Again, I've got to choose my language rather carefully. There came a moment when I think it was Occidental Petroleum had a drilling platform which was making its way towards one of these islands. Of course, Iran took a dim view of this. And so that was probably the most exciting moment, that we had to decide whether to stop an American vessel on the high seas. And the Royal Navy, I remember it was a ship called the HMS Yarnton, did stop this vessel. And we, for some reason, I can't remember the detail now, I may be Freudianly blocking this as well, Iran threatened to occupy these islands. And we had to decide whether to stop Iran. So we were within inches of a little war with Iran at that point. And I have to say, at that point, I did start, although I was relatively senior, I did start consulting higher up in the office, the chief legal advisor, because obviously we were sending dramatic notes about all this, and one just hoped one had got the law right. We decided whose territorial waters they were and how far they extended, and we'd drawn maps. And obviously we went eventually up to the Foreign Secretary, who had to be involved in, I think it was Alec Douglas Hume, had to be involved in these rather exciting matters. And it led to vast proceedings in the courts, up to the House of Lords, and then proceedings also in the United States between these oil companies. But I think I better not say anything more about all that, because A, I'm very conveniently failing to remember, and B, it's still very sensitive, apparently, because particularly Abu Musa and the Tums are still in dispute, I believe, their ownership. And of course the situation in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf is now so fraught and so dangerous that one has to be very careful. And
sorry, Professor Allott, I don't wish to interrupt you, but I just wondered whether you feel that British foreign policy has contributed to this, what we find today, the current very complex situation we find today.
Yes.
Or do you think that it's inherent in the sort of circumstances of the Middle East?
Well, I think both things are true, that it's ideally it would have been infinitely desirable that we remain there. But on the other hand, Britain's situation had changed so greatly. We, as you know, the two world wars more or less destroyed Britain. I always say we lost both of them, both those wars. So it is true, we couldn't afford to go on pretending we were an imperial power. But in a sense, it would have been extremely desirable that we did, because we were terribly experienced. We knew everybody, and we were very fond of these places. But we had to decide then, well, I remember we organized a mediation, which occupied a lot of my time. We got some gentleman in, I'm ashamed to say I've forgotten his name at the moment, to mediate one of the territorial disputes, not Abu Musa and Tums, but one involving two others of the states. And lawyers had to be appointed on both sides to represent themselves. And I've forgotten what the outcome of that mediation was, but that was interesting, constructing a mediation, interesting experience constructing a mediation. And that defused, as mediations always do, some, sort of very embarrassing situation. And people then, lawyers for the two sides, had to produce vast documents giving the whole history, really, of the Persian Gulf since 1820. But I was not physically involved in mediation once we'd set it up, so I can't remember much about what came out of it. One of the most interesting things is obviously we had to decide the political future, and indeed the constitutional future, of these places. And we decided eventually to set up a thing called the United Arab Emirates. And I've got to be careful what I say about this, because we had some fun choosing the name of the United Arab Emirates. Because, well, I won't say any more about that, but there were 100 things you could have called them. And the United Arab Emirates meant that they sat quite near us in UN bodies, a thing beginning with U, which probably was one of the considerations. So whenever I go past the Emirates Stadium on the way to London, I feel a sort of slight possessive feeling about it. So that was one little group of them, and then there was Bahrain, and I remember we advised against him calling himself king, the ruler of Bahrain. I think he is now called king. And then there were the other ones down the other end, including Muscat and Oman, which were terribly glamorous part of British imperial history. There were the Trucial Scouts, the British sort of local presence, military presence from the 19th century. Very glamorous sort of T. Lawrence stuff. And then there was the Muscat and Oman, where we ran the little army there. So I must say, for those of us who are rather fond of British imperial history, this was the most delightful thing to be involved in, although it was terribly sad.
Yes.
Really, one was experiencing a bit of the 19th century. And regretting that this was happening. And a certain amount of trouble has followed since.
Your earliest publication dates from that time. That was your Language, Method and the Nature of International Law in the British Yearbook. Was it difficult to publish articles while you were still a civil servant?
I no doubt had to show it to somebody. I can't remember showing it to anybody, that article. I hope that the first footnote says, I should really check this, but I hope the first footnote says that gives my status legal counsel of Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and this article reflects only the views of the author, that sort of thing you put in. And since it was extremely abstract and theoretical, I always regarded that as a bit comical, because I don't think Her Majesty's government had many views on the theoretical basis of international law. I can't remember now why on earth I wrote it, but it was already the beginning of, as it were, my own view of international law. And in an odd sort of way, that article has been quite influential, in that there became into international law a strand of what nowadays is called postmodernism. The article was called Language,
Method and the Nature of International Law.
Oh yes, that's right. Language, Method and the Nature of International Law. And of course the turn towards language is very much part of postmodernism, and to treat international law as a linguistic phenomenon. I think it was probably the first time that had been done, and many people obviously have gone much further with that since. So that was rather an odd event. As I say, I can't quite remember. So my time, and with the Arabian department in the Foreign Office, I became very, very close to the people in that department, of whom I was extremely fond. The head of the department was Anthony Ackland, who became Provost of Eton after he retired from the diplomatic service. And I remember David Myers, who became British Ambassador in The Hague, and Stephen Edgerton, who became British Ambassador in Rome, who had been almost a contemporary with here at Trinity. I remember he had the rooms under the clock in Trinity. So that was a very nice feature of the job, that one was working with people, really excellent people whom one really liked. So then when I came back, when I gave up that, I then became involved from 1971, I suppose, with the European Union business.
You were the UK permanent
Well, eventually, yes, but during the negotiation of the Treaty of Accession, I was sort of, like I mentioned about other treaty-making events, I was part of the London team negotiating the Treaty of Accession. Ian Sinclair, the chief legal advisor, spent most of his time in Brussels doing the actual negotiating. So as you can imagine, it was a fabulously complicated business. because the eventual Treaty of Accession was an enormous document, and it involved almost every Whitehall department. So we had enormous, endless meetings trying to agree instructions to be sent to Brussels. And that was terribly difficult and urgent work. And I was just thinking, one occasion I remember was a meeting at 9:30 one morning in the Home Office to discuss what should be the position of the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man in relation to the European Union. And I remember that morning getting to the office thinking, I don't know anything about the existing status of the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man, which is very obscure. So I think I looked in Chambers' encyclopedia and of course discovered the very odd nature of their status, Channel Islands not being really part of the United Kingdom, but being a possession of the Queen in a way. But we had to decide what to put in a protocol on the status. And so I went along to the Home Office and looked thoughtful and wise, but really, and of course it turned out to be quite controversial, that protocol, because the Channel Islands, the Isle of Man, got a considerably advantageous position, not full members of the European communities, but with some of the better advantages of the European community, so it turned out to be quite successful. And of course the highlight of that for me was we then had to draft the legislation to take us into the European communities, what turned out to be the European Communities Act 1972. And that, of course, involved many Whitehall departments, but the constitutional side of it, I think it's fair to say, was more or less done by me and a man from the Lord Chancellor's office, as it was then called Carl Newman. And obviously the problem was the famous problem of how on earth you introduce into the British legal system a new source of law, and a source of law which, very strictly speaking, overrides English law, including Acts of Parliament. And that was a bit of a tall order from a constitutional point of view, and needless to say, has had a vast subsequent history. So we had to write instructions for Parliamentary Council on the drafting of this bill. And to my dying day, I will remember the meeting that we went to in the offices of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel, who was called Sir John Fiennes. Beautiful offices in Whitehall. An afternoon meeting, 2:30, when he produced the first draft of the European Communities Act with the utterly brilliant, genius-level Section 2, which gives effect to community law, and another little section which includes Section 2.4, which gives overriding effect, but concealed behind some very complex words. Actually, I'm not sure we ought to put that in the final version of this interview. And we saw at once, we were struck silent by the brilliance. He was a famously clever chap who sort of did the Ximenes crossword in the Observer in 10 minutes or something. Brilliant man. I'm afraid I think he had a nervous breakdown later because the strain on him was immense. So he produced this little Act of Parliament with very few clauses, a bill with very few clauses, and we didn't change it. So clever. And it went through Parliament without a comma being changed. Immense constitutional event. And I think I can probably dare to say now that obviously we had to produce a white paper describing the effect of all these things. And it contained a sentence which made me consider resigning from the Foreign Office, drafted by Carl Newman, this sentence, which said, this legislation will not affect the sovereignty of Parliament. Well, I knew perfectly well that it did, unless you had a very complex view of the situation. Obviously, it would affect the sovereignty of Parliament. So I did ponder. And the Lord Chancellor thought it was absolutely essential to say this because Parliament would have exploded. So I did actually ponder whether I really ought to resign, since I was sort of agreeing to this sentence. But I didn't. And it went through Parliament incredibly without anything being changed. And so that was a very exciting time, because obviously every day we were facing new problems and giving instructions to the people.
Frenetic time it must have been.
Oh, it really
Absolutely.
was, and it was all done very rapidly. And the treaty accession was fabulously complicated. Hundreds of issues, including famous things like fisheries rights, which have been terribly controversial since, at creating a common fisheries policy. But all these things, and I have honestly to say that a lot of them one could not understand, obviously. Just in a day or two, you couldn't possibly understand all these things we were dealing with. But Ian Sinclair, a man I admire enormously, had the job of negotiating them. He was a very quiet Scottish man, and he was a terribly successful negotiator. And he had this little group, a famous group of people from the Board of Trade and Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries and so on, this little group of, I think, about 5 people, notorious negotiators in Brussels, tough as old boots. So they probably did quite a good job, I think, for the British. And as I mentioned last time, the British take all these things infinitely seriously. So not a single word would be, not thought about.
During this time, Professor Allott, did you or your colleagues interact with any political figures?
With who?
Did you interact with any political figures during this time?
No, I suppose we did. Of course, Edward Heath was the Prime Minister, but he was too busy to deal with the details. I'm trying to remember who the Lord Chancellor was. I simply can't remember. No. But it was civil servants because it was so complicated. At the very highest level there were political considerations, but this just had to be dealt with technically.
Was there a great celebration once this was achieved?
No. It was achieved eventually. Must have been sometime at the end of 71 or early 72, because then I was posted to Brussels as the legal counsellor in the British permanent representation to the European communities, because before we joined, we became a member on 1 January 1973, but we had before that 9 months of what was called a transitional period, where we were present at all the meetings of the European communities, physically present, but we were not legally parties. So I was the first legal counsellor in the permanent representation going for this transitional period. And I can't remember the dates precisely because the thing was still going through Parliament, the bill, when I was in Brussels. So I must have gone out right at the moment when the negotiation ended. I remember the then Foreign Office legal advisor, Chief Legal Advisor Vincent Evans. These things in one's life one remembers. His room was next door to mine in the Foreign Office. And one afternoon he and I happened to meet outside our doors. And he said, "Would you mind going to Brussels sort of next week?" And I said, well, I've just bought a house near Cambridge, and it would be extremely inconvenient. And he said, well, it is quite important, if you possibly could. So I did, and abandoned the house. Well, I came back to it later. And I remember that the bill was going through Parliament, because again, one of these isolated memories is that we got a telegram from the Foreign Office one day saying members of Parliament are a bit agitated because they can't understand how the European communities work. Because there were almost no books, nothing on it. Nobody knew. I didn't know. And they said, could you possibly by tomorrow morning give us a statement on how the institutions work to be laid in the House of Commons library? So somehow I had to get to work, and I didn't really know how the Council and the Commission and the Court and all these bodies worked, and the European Parliament. And as I say, there were almost no books. There were one or two books in French, which we had in the delegation. So that we sent this paper saying how they work, and that presumably is still in the House of Commons library somewhere. I dread to look at it. It's almost certainly wrong. But it seemed a reasonable request by members of Parliament, since these bodies were about to become rather powerful in Britain. It was a reasonable request to know how on earth they worked. How was the voting system and all that. That I remember. Another thing I remember on a smaller scale was that, as you know, all the documents in the European communities have a national colour. The German ones are all in yellow and the French ones are all in blue. So there came a delightful moment when we had to decide what colour to have the English documents in. And I remember going along one afternoon to a meeting in the European Commission where we would decide this. And there were various suggestions. And I think I'm right, I may be inventing this, but I think I did choose purple, which is the colour that they are in, for obvious sort of imperial reasons. I like to think that. It may be that it's really, there was in the end no choice, but I remember Monsieur Lelouch, the chap who ran Publications Division, well, he ran many other things in the Commission, but including that, I remember he held this meeting with the head of Publications Office. So that's one of my own sort of real, only material achievements, I think. And we worked very closely with the legal advisor of the Commission and the legal advisor of the Council, who were two, well, the one who was there when I arrived then retired, but the one who took over was a marvellous man called Klaus Ehlemann, a German. And the legal advisor of the Council was Puissochet, who became a judge on the International Court. And they were marvellous, intelligent people. But of course, they were not terribly inclined to tell us anything about how anything worked. For obvious reasons, they didn't want us to do it too well. So it was extremely laborious discovering. I remember one day I said to them, the House of Commons is quite interested. It says that we accept all the treaties concluded by the communities. Britain accepts them. The House of Commons has said, could we please know what these treaties are? And I had no idea what they were. And so I went along and said, could we please know? And they said, well, we've never made a list of them before. We can't really tell you what they are. So I said, well, it's quite important. But since Britain is about to be bound by all these treaties concluded with third countries and so on. So they did produce the first list ever of vast numbers of agreements concluded by the communities with other countries and so on. And then eventually there was a sort of communities treaty series, I think. But I was so amused that, and what I then formed the view, because I remember once going along and saying, I've come across this regulation, this is backdated. And I said, I'm terribly sorry, in British law, you cannot backdate laws. It's against the fundamental principle of the rule of law. And they said, oh, well, we sometimes do that. We sometimes backdate things if it's necessary. And what I'd formed the view was that, we think we're terribly pragmatic. The Continentals think we're very pragmatic lawyers. But it turned out that the British are much more formalistic than the Continentals. They don't really care very much what's in any of these things. We cared desperately about every single word. I was amazed at that. We always regarded them, as madly formalistic lawyers. But it was the British civil service tradition, that you didn't simply accept things. They've got to be right. And so they discovered that we went through everything with a fine-tooth comb. And then the British invented these two parliamentary committees, European scrutiny committees. I think we were the first to do it, and which to this day look through every draft Community Act. And their reports of those parliamentary committees are read all over Europe because they are a very good analysis of the advantages and disadvantages of every projected piece of legislation. And that was a great discovery for me. We turned out to be much more sort of serious, really, about all these things. And that's partly because of Parliament. Accountability of the government to Parliament is a very real thing in Britain. And I used to remember, a lot of time in government departments is spent preparing answers to parliamentary questions. And that's a very laborious business because you have to imagine the supplementary questions as well. And so the minister goes in with a little booklet, as it were. And then there's a row behind the ministers in the House of Commons where some civil servants sit, which is quite a frightening business because the minister can turn around and say, what the dickens does that mean, or something. Well, not he wouldn't do that personally, but his sidekick would. And parliamentary questions are taken enormously seriously by ministers. I remember ministers quivering before going into parliamentary questions because they're on show. And to be made to look stupid is terrible. So parliamentary questions were treated very seriously. So in Brussels, we'd obviously get lots of these. This afternoon, the minister has to answer this question. What is the answer? And that's very difficult because you've got to get it right.
Do you regret the entry into the EU? Or do you still think it was a good thing?
Well, I've always had two views on it, really. I'm passionately keen on European integration in a general sense. We belong together, the countries of Europe. But I'm fairly passionately against this sort of immensely statist body that the European communities are. Because they've been mostly made by the French and the Germans, strictly speaking. And of course, to put it politely, they have a very different history, experience of government. Germany really had a little moment of democracy in 1918, but really has only had democracy since whenever it is, 1950-something. And the French, through all their different revolutions, have a very different experience of democracy. So they've never really been able to understand why the British are so sceptical about the European Union as it is. I mean, a lot of us, particularly the British ruling class, are very fond of European countries and very fond of European culture. But we're bitterly opposed to excessive government and unaccountable government. Oddly enough, it probably won't go on your tape, but next week I'm going to speak to the all-party parliamentary committee on the Constitution about this European Union bill that's before Parliament at the moment. and which raises awful constitutional problems. And there, I will have an opportunity to say that on the one hand, on the other hand, we've got ourselves into the most frightful mess constitutionally in the European Union. So back to Brussels, and then, the main point I was going to make, which I mentioned in passing earlier, last time, is what a joy what I call multilateral diplomacy is, both in the UN and in the EU, because the EU, as it's now called, was obviously millions of meetings. It is essentially run by a thing called the Committee of Permanent Representatives, which is the sort of ambassadors, which is a very, very powerful body, which the Council more or less rubber stamps what the Committee of Permanent, so-called co-repair, more or less rubber stamps what they've decided. And co-repair, therefore, was the main activity. And again, obviously every day of the week it was a different topic. And so one had to advise our permanent representative, again, on things one hardly understood. I always say that when I left in my in-tray a request for advice on something called monetary compensatory amounts in the Common Agricultural Policy, which I simply couldn't understand, physically could not understand. And when I came to lecture on the subject here in Cambridge, I made an effort to understand what monetary compensatory amounts were, but I'm not sure I ever fully understood it. So there were these very difficult things. And then the co-repair obviously had hundreds of working groups under it, doing the real nitty-gritty, because the co-repair were rather grand people, ambassadors. And so you spent your life in these, in those days it was 9 member states, now it's 26 or 27 or whatever it is. And so that was a delightful activity, conducted in English and French. And obviously you got to know people well, and then at the end of the table there would sit the Commission people and the Council people. And I have to say I enjoyed that immensely. We had the advantage that very often we were working in English, which is wicked because it gives you a huge advantage, as in the UN. And B, it sort of involves, as in the UN, involves all your personality, really. Trying to put it crudely, get things past people from other countries. And that may involve saying good morning nicely to them, as in the UN, delegates lounge in the UN. You've got to always, that's the nature of diplomacy, you've got to always be trying to influence people. And I became a bit notorious because I would say things like, I think as a matter of good English, it would be a good idea to put will instead of shall or something. And of course, the ones who were more on the ball would notice that this had an enormous effect, and that I had an instruction in front of me which said, on no account would the word will be acceptable or shall be acceptable. But you had to put it in such a way. I wasn't involved in it, but forgive me for going off track a bit, but I remember a famous occasion that I heard about on the subsidiarity article in the draft constitution. And the British one day appeared, and I think it was the British Foreign Secretary, said, we would like to divide this article into 2 or perhaps 3 paragraphs. And all the other people there said, oh my God, on earth is the Foreign Secretary involving himself in ridiculous things like that? And it went through. And the article eventually came in 3 paragraphs. The British had noticed that if you divided it into 3 paragraphs, the second paragraph didn't refer to the first. And it was hugely important. Of course, they didn't explain that. But that, I use that as an example of the things you could do. And then you send a telegram in the evening saying, we managed to get this, that, and the other. And you all waited for the famous Foreign Office telegram the following morning saying, you spoke well. That was the sort of indication that somebody had noticed. So I must say I loved that and miss it terribly. Because, as I say, it involved the whole of you. So you spent vast amount of time doing that. And civil servants would come out from London for those meetings. Very, very specialist civil servants would come out. And forgive me if I've mentioned this before, but it always amused me. In the early days, they came very reluctantly. What are we going to this foreign place for, to discuss matters which are entirely our business? And we've no need. Our system is perfect on some detailed matter. What are we doing discussing this with all these foreigners? And they came, sort of rough, ordinary working suits, as it were. And then it all gradually changed. They liked coming on a sort of shuttle from London. They suddenly thought it was rather nice talking to all these foreigners, because by and large they used to win most things. And then they started wearing better suits and fitting in, to the international game. It was so funny, and of course they became very good at it because they were very, very knowledgeable about their own. And again, with parliamentary accountability, they knew that they had to defend this when they got back home, which very often foreign civil servants don't have to defend it to anybody. But their minister would have to get up into Parliament and say, we did rather well in Brussels. We got this text of this directive or something. It's amazing, the discipline. You wouldn't believe it, but the discipline of parliamentary accountability is a very real thing. I don't know now whether this is true, but it certainly was true then. So that was what it was like. And of course there were lots of parties there, endlessly. Because there were all the embassies in addition to all the permanent representations. So that was quite... I went to Luxembourg once or twice to the European Court. I was never involved in a case there at that time.
Did you have time to write during this period?
I don't think I did, actually.
I know that you published in 1972 your International Court of Justice.
Oh, I did write an article, actually, in French, from the Annuaire Français. I wrote an article.
Yes.
Because my French opposite number, gosh, I've forgotten his name, but he was the editor, one of the editors of the Annuaire Français. And he got me to write this enormously long article in French on European law in the United Kingdom. I don't know how on earth I did that. He was a remarkable chap. He was very, very clever. Puissachet was an énarque from the École Nationale d'Administration, who were wonderfully arrogant, one might say, intellectually. And this Daniel Vigne, that's right. He was a very, very clever chap. And I loved him because he was exactly in the French academic tradition. And I think I remember him once saying, in some speech that he was making, and ninthly, because the French tend to put things in order. And ninthly, I think he said, which of course the British are incapable of doing such things. So that was, and then I went back and more or less the following week came to Cambridge. I think I'll perhaps just say one word about leaving the Foreign Office, and which I don't quite know how it happened now. It was partly because there was a great family problem, which I won't go into. Partly that I did see, must have been 36 at the time, I did see that I had been a bit lucky in the things that I'd done. And it's not likely that I would have done such interesting things for the 25 years remaining. In those days, you just went up step by step. It may be different now, but in then, so you knew where you would be in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, and so on. And also, I decided to stand for Parliament. I'd got permission from Personnel Department to take part in local politics in Hampstead, where I lived. And when I went back to London, was going to do that. And in Hampstead, in the Borough of Camden, in London. But obviously you can't take part in national politics when you're a senior civil servant. So, and then I thought, it seems mad now, that being an academic would be a source of income while I was looking for a seat to get into Parliament. But of course, as soon as I got here, I discovered that being an academic was rather a full-time job. I thought, from the time as an undergraduate, that you just sort of messed around for 8 weeks and then all the rest of the time you were free. So I never did stand for Parliament, which of course is another of the might-have-beens of one's life. So then I came here and discovered that it was extremely arduous, but it was almost from week to week. I think I left Brussels and more or less the following week came here. I have to say that they were extremely nice in Brussels, extremely reluctant to let me go. And there again, they were marvellous people. The head of the mission was Sir Michael Palliser, whose wife was the daughter of the famous Belgian foreign minister who more or less founded the European communities. Stupidly, I've forgotten his name at the moment. And the head of Chancery was a man who played rugby for Scotland. And the last anecdote I will say is a painful one. He was extremely kind, and as I say, more or less tried to prevent me leaving. But then, once I'd started here, I remember being in London one day, waiting for a bus outside Charing Cross Station. It was pouring with rain, and I was utterly miserable. I looked across the road, and across the road is the headquarters of Coutts Bank. And this chap who'd been head of Chancery in Brussels was now chairman of Coutts Bank. And I thought, isn't life odd? Here's me, a pathetic little figure waiting in the rain, and there's he, the head of Coutts Bank, which is the Queen's Bank. But then that's how life organises matters. So I've probably forgotten things, but perhaps we could stop there.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Allott, for a marvellous account. And I'm looking forward very much to covering your time at Cambridge in our next interview.
Which is a completely different character.
Thank you.